As a graduate of Howard University and Meharry Medical College, Dr. Bignall completed his general pediatrics residency, clinical fellowship in nephrology, and NIH postdoctoral research fellowship at Cincinnati Children's. And as a physician advocate, his work really addresses the social determinants of child health, kidney health, and transplantation through community-based scholarship, engagement, and advocacy. He serves as a member of the White House Health Equity Roundtable series on access to care and inaugural chair of the American Society of Nephrology's Healthcare Justice Committee. He's also a member of the Council on Medical Legislation for the National Medical Association. Dr. Bignall is a recipient of the American Academy of Pediatrics Catch Award, or Community Access to Child Health Award, a John E. Louis Fund Advocacy Scholar for the American Society of Pediatric Nephrology, and was named a top 40 under 40 leader in minority health by the National Minority Quality Health Forum and the Congressional Black Caucus Health Blame Trust. And you may have met him on Twitter as Dr. Ray MD, but with that, I'm gonna pass it off to Dr. Ray Bignall.
Thank you so much, Dr. Floyd, and thank you, Dr. Leonard, and the entire, Lucille Packard Children's Hospital family here for the invitation. This has just been a great trip. Y'all have great weather out here. It's pretty out here. It's very, very nice. I appreciate you for taking me away a little bit from rainy Ohio. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk to you today about what Kids and Kidneys can teach us about racism in the Bay Area. And we just got a few objectives today, okay? We're gonna define racism and overview its historical context in the United States. We're gonna briefly highlight a few of the racial and ethnic health disparities that we see in pediatric kidney care, and use that to link those concepts to the structurally racist and unjust systems that perpetuate these disparities. And I hope to teach you how to do that in your own scholarship, no matter what discipline you're in. And then, of course, we will take a moment to discuss changes that we as child health professionals can make to help dismantle systems of inequality and promote health equity and justice where we are. I have no relevant financial relationships to disclose to you today. So I wonder if you guys remember where you were on July 19th, 2015, okay? I want you to go back in your memory, try to remember where you were at that day. Aside from it being my grandmother's birthday, something else very significant happened that day in my life. It happens to be the day that the Black Lives Matter movement came home to Cincinnati, Ohio, where I was doing my fellowship training at the time. It was the day that Mr. Samuel DuBose was shot and killed by a University of Cincinnati police officer, literally a few blocks away from the research building where I was sitting at the time that this shooting occurred. The announcement was upsetting that day, and the body cam video was even more upsetting after it was released. But the most upsetting moment for me that day came when I overheard the words of one of my white attendings, who, upon hearing the news of Mr. DuBose's death, didn't react with remorse or sadness at the loss of life, but instead by complaining about the prospect of protests happening in Cincinnati, our otherwise quiet hometown. It was as though the inconvenience of protests calling for racial justice was somehow more consequential than the extrajudicial killing of another man, a Black man like me, whose life mattered like my own. And my attending's words were upsetting that day, but if I'm completely honest with y'all, they were not surprising. After all, we've been here before and we'll probably be here again. So I wonder if you remember the name of Mr. Sam DuBose. You know, there isn't a community where I am privileged to give this Grand Rounds talk where there is not another name of someone whose life mattered and was cut short, often by violence at the hands of the state. Certainly in this community, the Bay Area, one of the most famous examples of this has been the killing of Mr. Oscar Grant. I'm reminded every time I think about him that he was my age. And in fact, died on New Year's Day, the same month as the inauguration of our first Black president. And you know, I wonder if we remember the name of Oscar Grant, or if his name is lost in a sea of names and hashtags that we've witnessed with increasing regularity in this country. And in the nearly 2 years since the unprecedented outpouring for the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, just this week, we've celebrated the 2-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. Celebrated, perhaps not the right word. We've acknowledged, we've recognized that horrific anniversary. And we've reflected on where we are as a country today versus where we were as a country 2 years ago this month. And what have we seen? Well, we've seen legislation to disenfranchise Black and brown voters at the ballot box. We've seen an increase in anti-immigrant sentiment, violence against Jewish, Muslim, and Sikh Americans, violence against our Asian and Pacific American neighbors. We've seen legislation targeting LGBTQ young people, youth. A reminder that the marches of 2020 did not represent the end of our work, but instead just another step along the road to justice. Justice for lives that matter. As this quote attributed to founding father Benjamin Franklin says, justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. And so the quest for justice leads us to an uncomfortable conclusion that racism rather is one of the most significant and pervasive cultural paradigms in the United States of America. And race and racism impact nearly every aspect of American life. At its core, racism works in tandem with systems of inequality that permeate nearly every aspect of our lives today. You know, and in a longer iteration of this talk, I would be able to describe in detail the impact of several of these structurally inequitable systems that pervade everyday life for Black Americans and many other Americans as well, including the care that we provide as pediatricians. But today, I would like to just highlight a few critical examples of socially unjust systems whose legacy continues to impact our communities today, including communities here in the Bay Area. And I think it's important that we start with the concept of residential segregation, the history of which is brilliantly outlined by Richard Rothstein in his 2017 bestseller, The Color of Law. If you have not read this book or listened to this audiobook, you are really, really missing out. I really encourage you, take some time this summer and learn about the history of residential segregation and the history of redlining by reading Richard Rothstein's book. It will illuminate so much for you in your practice taking care of children with disease. Neighborhood segregation really does represent the single greatest driver of inequality that we see in America today, despite the fact that many of the policies that segregated America were enacted nearly a century ago. Central to this understanding is a debunking of the so-called myth of de facto segregation. It's this concept that Americans are segregated in our country today because of culture or personal preference, rather than the truth that Americans have been segregated by law and by design. What do I mean? Well, as the federal government was seeking to bring Americans out of the mass poverty of the Great Depression, the ambitious and at the time politically liberal policy agenda of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal brought about policies to subsidize Americans' home ownership as a way of undergirding the growing middle class with wealth, which would represent for them an economic floor. Still today, home ownership represents the most significant opportunity for wealth transfer within families. It's how most families are able to build wealth for the generations that come after them. Homeownership represents the opportunity for financial freedom that enables many families in our country to withstand temporary layoffs or unplanned expenses like medical expenses, for example. The federal government provided these lifeline programs to millions of Americans, but Black Americans were explicitly excluded from this entitlement. While Black Americans were paying taxes that provided for these entitlement programs, the federal government explicitly said that if you were Black, you were not able to take advantage of the programs that your tax dollars were paying for. We see other examples of this as well, including, for instance, the GI Bill, which provided an opportunity for thousands and thousands of Americans returning from war to be able to take advantage of federal dollars to support educational opportunities for their advancement. Yet again, while Black Americans contributed, along with all other Americans, to the tax dollars that supported the GI Bill program, Black Americans were explicitly excluded from participating in its benefits. The Federal Housing Administration subsidized new home loans in suburbs all across the country for white Americans, but explicitly required that these new homes not be sold to Black Americans. It was part of the policy that would free these dollars to banks to be able to lend for home purchasing. And that these new homes that received this funding would have to include in their deeds language that said Black people couldn't buy those homes. And by the way, wasn't just Black folks, excuse me, but other so-called undesirable populations, in particular, Asian Americans and some Eastern European Americans as well, who were explicitly excluded from taking part in these programs. The justification for this idea was that the property values would decrease if these so-called undesirable racial groups were to find themselves purchasing homes in those neighborhoods. Maybe you've thought about this or heard this excuse as well. Well, the reason we don't want to have low-income housing in our neighborhood, or the reason we don't want to have these certain groups of people purchasing homes in our neighborhood, is that they will lower the home values. Well, the truth of the matter is, when these policies were enacted in the mid-20th century, the opposite was actually true. Believe it or not, when Black Americans were allowed to purchase homes in predominantly white suburbs, they often paid significantly higher than market value for those homes and would raise the property values in those areas. However, in an effort to maintain racial hegemony, these communities would sacrifice their home value and financial benefits that came from the increased property values when Black folks would buy these homes, simply to maintain the status quo and the racial hierarchy in their community. With devastatingly surgical precision, the federal government employed another program, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, to use color-coded maps like this map of San Francisco that I've included in the slide, to indicate which neighborhoods were worthy of federal investment and which neighborhoods were not. Often, the only justification for a community being labeled yellow or red, signifying it was a poor investment, rather than green or blue, signifying it was a good investment, was the racial makeup of the people living in those neighborhoods. The neighborhoods could be clean, well-maintained, and with beautiful homes, but if the people who lived in those neighborhoods were Black or immigrants, they were often labeled red or yellow rather than green and blue. And this determined which communities would receive those investment dollars. These historically redlined communities remain today the same communities where we see disproportionately impoverished and disproportionately decreased municipal investment that has led to a lot of the unfortunate poverty and gentrification that we see in some neighborhoods, that forces many of our marginalized communities out of the places where historically they have had a foothold. These consequences were significant and far-reaching. Residential segregation is just part of the story, though, y'all, because housing discrimination is another important example for us to highlight. This image that I've included in the slide is excerpted from the Real Estate Board's Ethics Handbook from 1924. It states that a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to the property values in that neighborhood. I've just described the faulty thinking that led to statements like this being part of practice with regards to real estate here in the United States. New Deal era housing policies were enacted to help provide this growing middle class with homes, not only through the subsidizing of home ownership through home loans in American suburbs, but also through the creation of housing projects in many municipal areas in the United States. Some of you might be really surprised to learn that housing projects never really began with the tremendous negative connotation that they have today with regards to their form and function. In fact, many housing projects in the mid-20th century were beautiful apartment complexes that were well-maintained and well-apportioned. However, they often, in fact, almost systematically included two buildings whenever these communities were erected, one for white folks and one for Black folks. And in fact, often introduced segregation into communities that were otherwise unsegregated. We have seen that some of the most segregated communities in our country are actually not in the southern United States, where Jim Crow laws and a legacy of de jure segregation is something that with which we're all familiar. But in fact, communities all over the United States, and mainly in the Northeast and the Midwest, had these segregated housing projects introduced into their cities that helped to create this dichotomy that we see. But the West Coast was not immune to these forces either. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the Daly City community in the Bay Area, this region of the country. Daly City is one of the examples of a community that was designed through municipal funds that were funneled by the federal government to be a segregated neighborhood in an otherwise unsegregated Bay Area during the mid-20th century. Well, how do we see this manifesting in our present day society? The so-called "not in my backyard" movement is an echo of the movements that we saw in the mid-20th century that helped to segregate our country. The "not in my backyard" movement thwarts the expansion of low-income housing to address our nation's housing crisis. And perhaps nowhere else in the United States is the housing crisis in such stark relief as it is right here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And today we see that African Americans are nearly 20% less likely to even be offered rental properties in many of these communities across the United States. So what about income? If we all consider that home ownership is the primary vehicle of wealth transfer in the United States, it should be no surprise then that Black Americans have significantly less wealth than their white counterparts, in large part because of the staggering wealth and income inequality in this country and the way that many marginalized and minoritized communities have been systematically prevented from the wealth building opportunities that those of us who are more privileged have had a chance to take part in. Think about, for example, these other structural barriers too, like wage inequality and the higher unemployment rates, or banking and lending discrimination, racial disparities in home ownership, and the lack of intergenerational wealth. You know, when we talk about banking and lending discrimination, again, this isn't something that happened in black and white photos of the 1950s. Wells Fargo, less than 10 years ago, had to pay out a multi-million-dollar settlement because it was proven by the Department of Justice that they were discriminating in their home loan practices in the 21st century, in the way that they were providing home loans, discriminatory home loans, predatory loans, primarily to minority communities here in the United States. It's all resulted in a phenomenon where we see that the average wealth held by a African-American family is 10 cents for every dollar of wealth accrued by a white family in the United States. And I like to tell folks, it's hard to pull yourself up by your bootstraps when time after time, generation after generation, you've been banned from entering the boot store. And we certainly cannot talk about systemic inequalities in America without talking about policing. There is a long history of racial injustice in policing practices that can really be traced to the use of law enforcement. One of their earliest jobs in this country was as kidnappers of men, women, and children who were then enslaved in the southern United States. And the use of police to enforce racial segregation and hegemony in communities across the United States in the 20th and 21st centuries. And, you know, you can just sort of imagine in your mind's eye the way that we've seen police differentially manage crises in our country, depending on the community of people that they are policing. One recent example has been on social media that I've seen recently, where folks have talked about the way in which individuals who commit mass atrocities, for example, the mass shooting in Buffalo, New York, where the shooters, if they happen to be non-Black, seem curiously to always be taken in custody alive, and start, you know, juxtaposing that to the way in which many African American individuals simply don't get that chance, armed or unarmed, when they confront police in our country. A growing body of literature explores the impact of police violence and policing practices on the health and well-being of children, particularly children of color. I would encourage you to familiarize yourself with the scholarship of my colleagues, Dr. Jacob Bohr at Boston University, and my friend and colleague, Dr. Nia Hurd-Garris at Lurie Children's in Chicago. There's incredible scholarship happening in this area in order to help us understand how we as a community can interface healthily with our law enforcement professionals who work day and night to help keep us safe, and how law enforcement can build back trust and reinforce healthy interactions with the communities that they serve and protect. This powerful artwork by my friend and fellow Howard University alum, Christian Capers, was featured on the cover of Academic Medicine back in 2020. And it depicts a Black man in medicine standing in the gap between racial violence against communities of color, often at the hands of the state, on one side, and health concerns and health disparities. In this image, the coronavirus pandemic, which has claimed the lives of 1 million Americans today, disproportionately Americans of color. It's led many of us in this country to declare racism a public health crisis in America. But what is racism, and how do we define it? Perhaps you know, you have found yourself struggling to define what racism actually is. Well, this is the moment. Those of you who, like me, like to tweet, this is the moment for you. Pull out your cell phones, you know, take a screen grab of this, put it up on your Twitter or Instagram. I am going to give you a definition of racism that you, I hope, will carry with you into the work that you do. The best working definition of racism that exists today, that was posited by rock star epidemiologist and family physician, Dr. Kamara Jones, past president of the American Public Health Association. She defines racism as a, quote, system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race, that unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, unfairly advantages other individuals and communities, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. What a great definition. Simple to understand and broadly applicable, because it's not a stretch to extrapolate from Dr. Jones' definition of racism a practical definition of other systems of oppression and marginalization that we see in our society today. Consider how this definition could be applied to sentiment against women, immigrants, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, people living in poverty, and many, many other marginalized and minoritized communities in our populations, rather, in our community. We must first deal honestly with systems of inequality before we can heal the disparities that they bring about. This is a good time for us to remind ourselves that race is a social construct and that there exists no biological basis for race. We understand scientifically that race is actually a very weak proxy for genetic diversity, and that it's comprised of poorly defined categories that are based on social norms, not on genetics or biology. And population studies have demonstrated greater variation amongst racial groups than between racial groups in our country. It's no surprise that race historically and inevitably has found its way into medicine, because medicine is part of society. And race and racism are part of our society too. An example of the racist application of race-based medicine is the history of the use of spirometry. This article that was published in The Atlantic in 2014 helps to bear that out for us. Plantation physicians in the apartheid South used spirometers to prove the weak lungs of Black people, or people of mixed race, described as mulattoes at the time, compared to whites, as justification for their enslavement and employment, forced labor in dire conditions during the period of American slavery. Even Thomas Jefferson notes in his publication, Notes on the State of Virginia, that this data proved that Black bodies were, quote, fit for the field and little else. This notion has been reinforced even in the 21st century literature, when the racialized use of spirometry is quoted in the literature. And to this day, race-based estimates of lung capacity have their basis in this history and are often accepted as practice. So how do racism and systems of inequality influence child health today? And how can we recognize and document it in our own scholarship? I want to show you just a handful of papers as examples of how you can critically appraise your own research to understand how injustice intersects with the clinical care that we provide our patients. Of course, I'm going to use examples from pediatric nephrology because it is the objectively most and best subspecialty on planet Earth. I'm just kidding. But I also hope that you can use these examples to extrapolate a framework for understanding how racism and structures of inequality impact the care that you provide your patients to. All right? So one example of the most common uses for race in medicine is the presence of a so-called race modifier in adult estimating equations for GFR. Now, I know you didn't enjoy your renal block in med school. Neither did I, okay? And I promise I'm not gonna bore you with a bunch of renal physiology that, quite honestly, is absolutely spectacular. But I'm not gonna bore you with it. Instead, I'm gonna try to break this down as best I can for you to appreciate the controversy and where we are with it today. In order to avoid expensive and invasive methods for measuring kidney function, we in nephrology have developed estimating equations to approximate kidney function, okay? And we often use the serum biomarker creatinine as the basis for those equations. Creatinine is a protein, it's found in blood, and it happens to vary with body composition and muscle mass, which also happen to be anthropometric indices, which have been prone to racial bias for centuries. For years, two of the most popular equations for estimating GFR have used a race modifier to account for the statistically significant difference in GFR when the study populations where those equations were derived separated the cohort of people into two categories, Black and non-Black, okay? But if race is a social construct, how can it be consistently and appropriately applied to GFR? And how was race measured in those studies? Is genetic variation taken into account? What about the races of the people in the non-Black category? That's white people, that's Asian and Pacific Americans, that's, oh my gosh, this grand diversity of people. Are you telling me that we're going to put all those folks into one bucket and that the only people where there's something different about their GFR are people who happen to identify socially in this country as Black? Nephrologists today are really beginning to rethink how we approach those conclusions. A good friend of mine, Dr. Amaka Ananya, who at the time she did this work, was at University of Pennsylvania's Penn Medicine group. She and her colleagues note that the race modifier in the estimation of GFR can result in really significantly higher GFRs for African-American patients than for others. And you might say, well, isn't that great? Don't we want patients who are African-American to have higher GFR? Well, it can have unintended consequences. A higher estimated GFR can lead to differences in drug dosing, transplant wait times, CKD referral, and dialysis initiation. And so it's really important to appreciate the impact of those differences. So the question must be asked, if we see a disparity based on the use of this equation that could delay care for African-American patients, how does that potential exacerbate the disparities we see in kidney disease for that population? And how do they intersect with the structural inequalities that we've been talking about today? Well, consider that decreased access to nutritious food, for instance, could accelerate the progression of CKD. These patients should be seen sooner and not later, and we know that food insecurity is disproportionately seen in communities of color. Disproportionate representation of low-wage jobs and underinsured status amongst individuals of color can also decrease their access to care. Another reason why we need to see these patients sooner rather than later. Poor health literacy and an inability to navigate the healthcare system means that patients are presenting later in their disease course. So if they have an artificially elevated estimated GFR, they might in fact be farther along in their course of CKD when they come to see us. We also know that communities of color, minoritized communities in this country, experience increased stress and allostatic load that contributes to renovascular disease and hypertension. Another reason why these patients should be seen sooner rather than later. And of course, delayed referral for chronic kidney disease, dialysis, or transplant care means longer wait times for a kidney transplant and increased dialysis morbidity. Last year, a consensus task force of the American Society of Nephrology and the National Kidney Foundation declared that the use of race modifiers should not be used, in estimating equations of GFR, and actually published a few months ago findings that showed that the use of a new modified estimating equation without the use of a race modifier not only had an accurate representation of estimated kidney function, but reflected smaller differences between populations. So more accurate and more precise. And in fact, across the country, this new estimating equation for GFR is what we are using to estimate the kidney function of adult patients. I'll also point out that in pediatrics, we're fortunate that the estimating equations we have used to estimate kidney function in children have never used race modifiers. However, as pediatric nephrologists, we often take care of young adults and adolescents who are large enough, tall enough for us to use these estimating equations. So it's been a relevant conversation for us as well. Let's take a look at another example. My friend and colleague, Dr. Michelle Starr, published this paper a few years ago, looking at the impact of food insecurity and healthcare utilization in children with end-stage kidney disease on dialysis, all right? We know that food insecurity is seen in about 20% of American households, but we see it in roughly 60% of those on dialysis, particularly in her cohort. We saw that there's higher healthcare utilization amongst these children, increased infection rates, and lower health-related quality of life. I'm preaching to the choir of those of you who take care of kids with kidney disease and those who have seen children on dialysis. But this is a really, really significant thing. These children are already at increased risk for additional morbidity just from being on dialysis. And yet their food insecurity is placing them at increased risk. How? Well, we know that housing status can actually impact your dialysis options. And home dialysis is preferred to in-center dialysis for children. And then we also know then that housing insecurity is a major risk factor for food insecurity. And we see these things go hand in hand. Again, you guys are smart pediatricians here at Stanford. You appreciate that nutrition and chronic kidney disease are inextricably linked. And growth impairment that we see with lack of access to nutritious food can have an impact on transplant readiness. If you don't make enough money to make ends meet, and Lord knows here in the Bay Area, we have a lot of income inequality that impacts our patients, that can impact our patients' ability to find and access nutritious foods. We've talked already about residential segregation and the history of redlining that correlates with food deserts, and over-policed neighborhoods are less desirable for investment, less likely to attract supermarkets and fresh food vendors. And finally, this paper talked about increased healthcare utilization that's associated with food insecurity. Well, increased healthcare utilization in the context of end-stage kidney disease and a variety of other chronic conditions that children face are burdens to the safety net programs, the subsidized safety net programs that our patients rely on. That money doesn't grow on trees, folks. And for our patients to be using higher and higher amounts of these subsidized funds means that there's less in the pool for other children. And so addressing food insecurity as a factor, a risk factor in these patients can help us to preserve the funding for those subsidized safety net programs that so many children rely on. Okay, just one more paper. I really want to talk about this one because some of you all may remember a former pediatric nephrology fellow at Stanford, Dr. Jill Crisberg, really good friend of mine, who's now at Lurie Children's in Chicago. And we do this all the time, right? Like I showed you all this health disparity data. It's super sad. It's super depressing, okay? What can we do about it? Well, I'm going to show you what we can do about it because the same way that racism in medicine is engineered, we can engineer solutions to the disparities that we see by mitigating the effects of racial bias in the work that we do. Here is an example of that work. In 2014, a new organ allocation system was put into place for assigning kidneys to people who need them on the kidney transplant waitlist. Not going to go into too much detail about it. All you need to know is that the updated system in 2014 was designed to address inequities that we saw in racial and ethnic groups who were less likely to receive kidney transplants, including racial and ethnic minority groups, okay? And so what did Dr. Crisberg and her team show? They showed that the changes that were put in place in 2014 to help make access to kidney transplants more equitable for racial and ethnic minority communities in the United States actually worked, that they were able to decrease time on dialysis and improved short-term graft loss in terms of equity for those populations after the new system was put into place. This work demonstrates that systems-level changes can be engineered that help us to address racial disparities in kidney and child health, and represents the first really significant publication in the decade to show that. Put another way, there is no reason why kidney health disparities have to remain baked in to the healthcare delivery systems that we see. And in the interest of time, I will just highlight quickly these examples of things that nephrologists and pediatricians can do to help address the inequality that led to the disparities we saw in transplantation. We talk about advocating for housing, advocating for the increased access to nutritious foods, supporting institutional and policy changes that influence that mitigate the influence of income on our patients' access to excellent care, helping to support health literacy as well, and supporting environmental justice, not only with things on a local level like the sort of impact of lead and arsenic and other environmental toxins in our patients' homes, but also the absolutely critical work of physicians, pediatricians, and even pediatric nephrologists addressing climate change, which is impacting the health and well-being of all of our patients. Okay, now, Dr. Ray, you're telling me on one hand that race is a social construct with no biological basis. But on the other hand, you're showing me all this data that seems to suggest that race and racism impact child health. How do you square the two? Well, am I saying that race or racism, understanding of racism has no place in research or clinical practice? Not at all. What I am saying is that race is real, but as a social construct, its inconsistent and biased use in drawing biological conclusions is incredibly fraught. And we, as careful pediatricians and researchers who seek first to do no harm, must carefully understand its context and understand how it impacts the conclusions we draw. Because after all, when we measure the impact of race, often we are measuring the impact of racism on our patients and their care. I want to say a quick word about trust. It's been something that we have discussed recently around the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's something that we hear a lot about, particularly with regards to our African-American patients. Very often we see the slides where we talk about the Tuskegee syphilis study, and we seem to want to attribute all mistrust within the African-American community specifically to Black and white photos from our past, including those of the disgusting atrocity that took place there in Tuskegee, Alabama, with the syphilis study there. However, it's important to realize that many Black Americans, myself included, have personal experiences with family members that reinforce our mistrust of the healthcare providers that come in contact with us. And I love this quote from really world-renowned pediatric, or excuse me, well, she's a MedPeds trained individual, but she's a physician and a humanist in medicine, Dr. Kimberly Manning at Emory University and Grady Hospital in Atlanta, where she says, acknowledging every aspect of the barriers for Black American, in this case, to enrollment in clinical trials is critical to moving forward. We are not simply untrusting, we remember. So when you encounter patients and families who are untrusting of your medical advice or your opinion, or seem not willing to fully engage in a therapeutic alliance with you, consider instead rather, why they are mistrusting. Consider instead what it will take for you to earn their trust, realizing that they bring to the table the baggage of, in many cases, generations of experiences that reinforce the mistrust that they have in us. So, how can health professionals work to dismantle systems of inequality and injustice in kidney care? First, we can acknowledge with our patients and our colleagues the racism that we see in the world around us. Listen to our colleagues and make sure that they understand, or rather that they feel seen, valued, and heard when they share their experience. And then, of course, do the work. Study the deep well of sophisticated scholarship on how to develop anti-racist teams and practices that promote health equity for our patients. We've got to champion workforce diversity and inclusion. You guys do that, do a great job of that here at Stanford with many of the tremendous programs that you guys have enacted, and the amazing work that you all are doing here. I'm so proud of so many of my friends who are doing such a great job here, and the work that you do. Y'all, it's about more than just pretty pictures on social media. It's about developing relationships that support our underrepresented minority and other marginalized groups who are training on our campuses. We should be screening for social determinants of health in our pediatric encounters. We should be educating ourselves by engaging with new voices. You know, social media is a terrific place to do that. For instance, you can engage with me on Twitter, Instagram at Dr. AMD. And I engage with many of you and have learned so much from you all about the work that you're doing here in the Bay Area and in the communities that you are a part of and serve. We've got to encourage implicit and explicit bias training for faculty and staff. And it's especially important for our clinic-facing folks to understand their biases and to learn how to counteract the explicit bias, racism, transphobia, homophobia, sexism that we see in the workplace as well. Listen first, don't be afraid to ask questions. And those of us who are asked the questions should be patient with our colleagues who may say things a little inelegantly when they're talking to us. We should develop sincere empathy for those who are crying to be heard and helped. Become active bystanders when confronting racist and intolerant language. I've heard this described as an active bystander, an upstander, a champion, whatever the word is we want to use today. The concept and sentiment is the same. Don't stand idly by while people are being abused as our colleagues, especially on the basis of their identity. And we should also develop backbench community partnerships. What do I mean by this? Resist the urge to colonize the communities that you serve. Allow communities to maintain agency and autonomy and come along them with expertise and always stay in the background. And of course, talk is cheap. Institutional statements must be backed by action and accountability. And we really should be encouraging our institutions to not only have milquetoast statements of diversity and equity, but really value the work necessary to bring about more equitable workplaces and outcomes for our patients. I will end our talk there and would really welcome the opportunity to engage with you guys in questions and answers. I just want to once again thank you all for the chance to be here for a few days and spend some time with you all. I've learned a lot. I hope I've been able to be a positive influence on your campus. I'm really looking forward to noon conference so I can meet these dope residents that I see on social media and answer you all's questions. But I would be delighted to take questions at this time. And I know that it's a little bit later than I had hoped. And so I'm willing to stay back maybe 5 or 10 minutes if there are others who have questions and want to engage with me. Thank you so much.
Dr. Bignall, thank you so much for that tour de force. We have some questions in the Q&A. The first is asking a little bit more about the specific changes made in the kidney allocation system to counter those systemic disparities and how the developers of that system got buy-in to make those changes.
It's a great question. The second answer is maybe a shorter answer, but the buy-in came because the community spoke up. The disparities that we saw impacted minority communities substantially more. And there was just too much energy within those communities for change to be ignored. And so those changes involved how and when the organs are allocated, specifically rules around distance in order to ensure that organs were able to cross state lines more easily. Without going into too much detail about it, there were some, because of the way that the allocation rules were set up, certain metropolitan areas where there happen to be larger populations of Black and Brown folks, and disproportionate number of African American and Latinx folks are on the list for kidney transplant. Those metropolitan areas were disadvantaged, whereas less populated areas were not in the rules about how organs were allowed to cross state lines. So they made changes to reflect distance, absolute distance from a transplant center, rather than within the state itself, that helped to accommodate some of those changes. That was made possible by UNOS, United Network for Organ Sharing, UNOS being the governing body that helps to create these rules. So it really did depend on advocacy from the community of people waiting for kidney transplants and physicians who are part of the kidney transplant community, speaking up and creating change in the policy.
So really a good example of putting those two things together, that community engagement and our own advocacy using our knowledge.
Exactly.
One question or comment that's come up is how important it's been in international contexts like India to be able to make food insecurity interventions to be more significant, and the importance of preventive and social medicine there, and partnering things like simple health education and vaccination with going into the community to provide those resources and supports. Are there things that you would add that we could think about as ways to advance our social and preventive medicine here?
Yes, there are so many great examples of work that's being done to advance social and preventative medicine. And I can give you some examples from nephrology. So I mentioned the work of my colleague, Dr. Michelle Starr, who, by the way, did that research that I mentioned. She did that research while a fellow at Seattle Children's. And so I want to make that point because there are many of you listening right now who are residents and fellows, and you have an interest in doing social or preventative medicine. Her work stands right now as the single most impactful study on food insecurity in all of pediatric nephrology. And for that reason, it was published in our highest impact factor journal, JAMA Pediatrics, and received a great deal of accolades. So what did she do in response to that work? She opened a food pantry for children on dialysis. She started that project in Seattle, and now that she's a faculty member at Indiana University, she is starting a food pantry there as well. So I mean, a food pantry and a dialysis clinic. What? When I tell you that her patients absolutely value this, it has become an essential part of the care that they're providing. I am not lying. And I will say this too, it's being replicated elsewhere. At Nationwide Children's, we are in the process of evaluating the steps necessary for us to open a food pantry in our dialysis unit because our patients need it too. Where you see a need, particularly a need that you note in your health disparities work, whether it's local quality improvement, science type work, or robust research related work, don't just describe the need and let it hang out like a dead fish on the table, right? Address the need. Just, discover what's necessary to address the need. And I'll tell you, you will find a lot of willing partners in your division and other places, even some of our basic and translational researchers who have their heads down in a fume hood and dealing with pipettes. And I don't know what you smart people do who do that stuff. Even many of our colleagues in those disciplines are also looking for ways to exercise their passion for health equity in a concrete way, and would be delightful partners with you too.
One person's asking about if you have any thoughts about Moderna slowing down their original SARS-CoV-2 vaccine studies in order to enroll more minority patients or minority subjects, excuse me.
That is a good question. I had not considered it. So these comments are unprocessed. I think right now I'll respond to it this way. I don't have a specific comment about Moderna slowing down the trial. I will say that there is an urgent need for us to address the hesitancy in many minority communities to being involved in research. And we're not doing enough research to understand why minorities do not want to be involved in research. I think we falsely attribute many of these concerns, as I mentioned before, to things in the faraway distant past, rather than understanding the threats to relationships, healthy therapeutic relationships between the healthcare establishment and many communities of color and other minoritized communities. For example, many rural white communities who are distrusting of what we big city physicians and researchers have to say about what we're doing. So I really do think we need to spend more time in these communities, canvassing them. We need to spend more time engaging them in the process of recruitment. It's really important that we have folks from these communities that are hesitant involved in the process of recruiting for these studies if we're going to see better representation.
That really builds into this next question, is how important is it, how important do you think it is for our clinical work to be situated within these underserved and marginalized community of color? And what might be best practices to be able to sustain that trust that we're all trying to re-earn?
Yep. Number one, it's critically important. You cannot expect to have a good relationship with people who don't know who you are. This is just basic relationship, right? Like if the only time I called my grandma was when I wanted money or something from her, then we're not gonna have a great relationship. I love my grandma, so I talk to her all the time. And I think, if we really want to demonstrate to a community that we care, we got to talk to them. Very often, big anchor institutions like yours and like mine, we almost act afraid of the communities that we serve. We don't spend time in them. We don't engage with them when there's nothing that we want. When was the last time that your institution held a town hall for folks in a predominantly minoritized part of this community where it was just open forum? We're not here to talk about some public health crisis. We're not here to talk about the new building we want to build in their neighborhood or whatever. We're just here to talk. What concerns do you have? What questions do you have? In a robust way. I know this is something that I advocate heavily for at my institution and will continue to push for because I do think it's very, very important. So I definitely want to encourage us to get out into the community before there is a crisis where we need to be there. Because people need to know who we are before the crisis requires that they know who we are. So I would say that that's the first and most important step to actually getting in there.
Thank you. We wanted to end on one last question that really focused on your specialty. Though it's not as pertinent in pediatric medicine, can you comment on why we might learn in medical school to prescribe hydrocortisone, calcium channel blockers as first line for hypertension in Black folks, but ACEs and ARBs in others?
Yeah, so this is something that we hear about a lot. There are studies that have shown that there are differences in response to therapy amongst individuals who identify as African American with regards to treatment with thiazide diuretics and calcium channel blockers versus ACEs and ARBs, and these sort of relatively limited studies have been used now, and the community hears that Black folks shouldn't get ACEs and ARBs. And I will tell you that, and I'm not an adult nephrologist, so I have to caveat this and say I'm not as deeply invested in that patient population. But I hear this even in my pediatric patients. In fact, I prescribed an ACE inhibitor for one of my patients, and the patient and family were African American. They went to their school, and the school nurse told them Black patients shouldn't get ACE inhibitors, so you should stop the medicine. And the teacher said, well, my doctor's Black. And it became an opportunity to have this conversation. You know, we really, really do ourselves a disservice when we attribute medical therapeutic decision-making to race, because race in and of itself is not the marker to appreciate variability in response to a certain drug. We don't know anything about the ancestry of the people who were part of those studies that, you know, where they were put into a Black group. We don't necessarily understand why those patients may have responded differently to that category of drugs. And particularly as a pediatric nephrologist, I think it's very, very fraught for us to extrapolate anything when we don't see those same findings in our pediatric patients. So, you know, I'll be honest and say that the sort of nuances of the discussion are in adult nephrology are not those that I've spent a tremendous amount of time with, particularly lately, because there's a lot of scholarship that's come out lately that's basically said we really need to take another look at our prescribing practices around hypertension in individuals who identify as Black or African American. But I will say from our pediatric point of view that we really got to be careful about how we attribute particularly adult studies that utilize race-based conclusions to medicine when we extrapolate those to children. And we've not seen that same relationship in pediatric nephrology. And I will tell you, I've had conversations with Dr. Joseph Flynn, who some of you may know is the author of the Pediatric Hypertension Guidelines. He is a big proponent of ACEs and ARBs as first-line therapy for children with hypertension, as am I. And probably in the years to come, you will see that as very much accepted practice for all children with hypertension, regardless of their racial and ethnic background.
Thank you so much for acknowledging that tension and how much the information and data that we have continues to evolve, and it's going to continue to evolve our practice. I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Leonard to finish us out.
Thank you, Ray. So I'm really optimistic that we're going to have one more resident going into pediatric nephrology because of this presentation. So thank you for doing what you can for our workforce problem. And we're so proud of Jill and the work that she did around transplant and the opportunities. I just wanted to mention that 20 years ago, I had funding from Genentech to look at dialysis dose, which we all know is such an important determinant of outcomes. And it was funding from Genentech to look at greater dose was better growth. That paper ended up showing that Black children were getting less dialysis. In the dialysis unit in 50 academic, you know, we hold ourselves, you know, we have so much pride in what we do. Black children were getting less dialysis. And when I presented at the national meetings, people came up to me and said, thank goodness my unit was not in that study. I said, your unit was in that study. That people also said, well, maybe it's just because of transportation and they don't get in and get the dialysis. I said, we did this study when they were in the unit. So it's probably much worse than you think. What I would love to do is go back and look at the discussion section, what we thought we knew 20 years ago, and maybe think about some opportunities to readdress what we do in our dialysis units in children's hospitals. So thank you for challenging, you know, all of us to even hold ourselves accountable. We're so thrilled you're here, and I just can't thank you enough for joining us. So
thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, thank you. See you soon. Bye.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.